To understand the magnitude of what occurred in the shivering darkness of 1959, one must first grasp the paralyzing atmosphere of an era where the sky itself had become a Soviet propaganda billboard. The world was standing at a terrifying crossroads, watching the red moon rise as the Soviet Union's Sputnik and subsequent Lunik missions shattered the Western illusion of technological invincibility. It was a time when American pride was being tested on a global stage, with every Soviet launch acting as a hammer blow to the morale of the free world, suggesting that the future belonged not to the ideals of Jefferson and Lincoln, but to the iron-fisted command of the Kremlin. But while the Soviet leadership basked in the spotlight of international acclaim, parading their Lunik satellite, the crown jewel of their space program, across neutral nations as an untouchable icon of communist superiority, they failed to realize that the United States does not accept second place as a permanent condition. They underestimated the cold-blooded, calculating and relentlessly brilliant minds of American intelligence, men who realized that if they couldn't build a better rocket by morning, they would simply steal the secrets of the one the Soviets had already built. This wasn't just a mission. It was a declaration that American ingenuity knows no borders, no locks, and no limits when the survival of the democratic world is at stake. The strategic landscape of 1959 was a high-stakes poker game where the Soviets held all the visible cards, but the CIA was busy building a new deck in the shadows. The Lunik satellite was more than a machine. It was a mystery box that held the answers to the most critical questions of the century. How were the Soviets achieving such massive thrust? What frequencies were they using to guide their probes to the moon? How was their internal circuitry hardened against the vacuum of space? To the public, the Lunik sat behind velvet ropes, guarded by elite KGB units, and surrounded by an aura of impenetrable security that made even the thought of an inspection seem like madness. However, the American intelligence community, driven by a desperate need to close the technology gap, began to notice a flaw in the Soviet display of power, a logistical dead zone during the transport of the satellite between exhibition cities. They discovered that the massive crate-enclosed satellite was often left on a truck with minimal escort during the late-night hours before being loaded onto a freight train. This was the opening the Americans had prayed for, a razor-thin window of opportunity that required a level of coordination, balls of steel courage, and technical expertise that had never before been combined in a single clandestine operation. The night of the intercept began not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical precision of a master-class ambush. As the Soviet transport truck rumbled through the dimly lit, rain-slicked streets of a foreign capital, it was being trailed by a fleet of American shadow cars, manned by agents who were prepared to trigger an international incident or even forfeit their lives to ensure the mission's success. With a sleight of hand that would make a stage magician envious, the CIA team managed to divert the truck into a pre-selected, high-security warehouse, while a decoy vehicle continued along the original route to keep the Soviet handlers in a state of oblivious comfort. The moment the warehouse doors groaned shut, the atmosphere shifted from the tension of the chase to the clinical intensity of a forensic laboratory. A team of the finest engineers, physicists, and master photographers, men who had been briefed in total secrecy and flown in under false identities, descended upon the massive wooden crate with a singular patriotic purpose. They were about to perform an unauthorized autopsy on the most advanced piece of hardware on the planet, and they had exactly 8 hours to do it before the sun and the Soviet military came looking for their prize. Working in the eerie glow of portable work lights, the American team faced their first hurdle. The crate itself was a masterpiece of Soviet counterintelligence, held together by specialized lead seals and custom fasteners designed to show the slightest hint of tampering. But American operatives had spent weeks practicing on replicas, developing tools that could bypass these safeguards with the delicacy of a watchmaker's touch. As the heavy wooden panels were finally pried loose, the Lunik emerged from its shell like a silver god of the new age, its polished surfaces reflecting the sweat-streaked faces of the men who were about to strip it of its dignity. There was no room for error. A single dropped wrench, a scratched serial number, or a smudged lens could have ignited a diplomatic firestorm that would have led straight to World War III. Yet these Americans worked with a calm, focused ferocity, driven by the knowledge that every photograph they took and every circuit they mapped was a nail in the coffin of Soviet orbital dominance, proving that American excellence is most potent when it is operating under the greatest pressure imaginable. The technical deep dive into the Lunik's heart revealed a fascinating paradox of Soviet engineering, a mix of rugged, almost primitive durability and high-concept scientific brilliance. The Americans were astonished to find that the satellite was not just a hollow shell for show, but a fully functional flight-ready model, packed with the very radio transmitters and guidance systems that had been mocking NASA from the lunar surface. For hours, the warehouse echoed with the rhythmic click of high-resolution cameras and the hushed, urgent debates of scientists as they dissected the Soviet logic of spaceflight. They mapped the wiring harnesses, identified the chemical composition of the hull, and most importantly, they decoded the communications arrays that allowed the Kremlin to track their probes across the cosmos. This wasn't just industrial espionage, it was a total intellectual conquest. The team was effectively downloading the entire Soviet space program into a series of film canisters and handwritten schematics, ensuring that when the sun rose, the United States would no longer be guessing. They would know exactly what they were up against. As the clock ticked toward the dreaded hour of 5 in the morning, the operation entered its most perilous phase. The reset. The satellite had to be reassembled, the internal systems restored to their exact original state, and the crate resealed so perfectly that the Soviet guards would find it as pristine as they had left it. This was the ultimate test of American craftsmanship. Every screw was torqued back to its precise position, every dust mote was accounted for, and even the CCCP stenciling was inspected for the slightest deviation. The agents worked with a frantic yet controlled energy, their hearts hammering against their ribs as the first hints of dawn began to bleed into the horizon. They were rebuilding a lie, a perfect deception that would allow the Soviets to continue their tour, smugly confident in their security, while the real power had already been siphoned away. The truck was rushed back to the railway station, sliding into its spot just as the Soviet officers arrived, yawning and oblivious, to oversee the final leg of the journey. The Americans watched from the distance, exhausted but filled with an electric sense of triumph, knowing they had just executed the greatest silent victory in the history of the Cold War. In the aftermath of that fateful night, the intelligence gathered from the Lunik heist became the secret roadmap for the American journey to the moon. The data allowed NASA to adjust their own frequencies, understand Soviet payload limitations, and eventually leapfrog over the Kremlin's achievements with the Apollo program. While the world would later cheer for Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the foundation of that success was laid in a dark warehouse by men whose names remain classified, but whose legacy is written in the stars. It is a story that should make every American heart swell with pride, a reminder that when the chips are down and the stakes are the highest they can possibly be, the United States does not just compete. It innovates, it adapts, and it wins through a combination of raw bravery and peerless intelligence. The Soviets may have had the first satellite, but the Americans had the smartest moves, proving forever that the true frontier of the space race wasn't just in the heavens, but in the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to be outshone.